Hearty shalom to you, Jeffrey Seif here. We're picking up at a sad moment. You know, parting is difficult sometimes. And I mention this because Rabbi Paul has gathered together some of the leaders and he's saying goodbye. And he's a bit harsh. And that follows a tradition, by the way. I'll explain, but if you will, open up your Bibles to the book of Acts, chapter 20. And he says in verse 25, look, this is it. You're never going to see my face again. And I testify you, I'm innocent of the blood of all. An interesting expression. I did not shrink back from declaring to you the whole purposes of God. He wasn't sheepish. He was very, very direct. So he says, you know, I didn't hold back anything. I think today, by the way, conversely, in a lot of congregations, you know, ministers are a bit sheepish about speaking prophetically and dealing with sin and circumstance, in part because, you know, the payroll's due on Monday. And there's this interesting dynamic where you're responsible to lead people on the one hand. On the other hand, you know, you are sheepish about things because they lead you, you know, with their money, if you will. It's a rather interesting dynamic. Of course, Paul didn't have to worry about mortgages and salaries. He worked with his own hands. And since he wasn't overly leveraged to people, he was freer to speak his mind. He says in 28, take care of yourselves and all the flock of which the Ruach HaKodesh has made you overseers to shepherd. You know, them first. He says in verse 29, and here's where I'd mentioned that he's a bit draconian, a bit harsh, but there's a tradition for that. He says, I know that after my departure, straight up, savage wolves will come in among you, not sparing the flock. You know, I've done everything I can, but I know when I'm gone, wolves are going to come in among you and chew up the sheep. Even from among yourselves will arise men speaking perversions to draw the disciples away after themselves. I mean, you could say this isn't really a way to say goodbye. It is a way to say goodbye because it's the way he's doing it. It's the way Moses did it as well, by the way. And in Deuteronomy chapter 31, verses 27 through 9, Moses says much the same. He gathers together. There's a parting word. It's less about an awareness of, I know there's a bunch of scoundrels among you. Come on, wake up and smell the coffee. Who you kidding? You're not fooling me. It's less that prompts this kind of discourse, as much as it is of realization that human nature being what it is, that God gets about his work and it can start to unravel shortly thereafter. We're constantly wrestling against the unraveling. I mean, be gut level honest, we do it in our own selves. You know, we possess, you know, religious faith and virtue, and, you know, we have to be on top of that lest it just kind of evaporate, lest it dissipate. And Paul says as much here. I know that, look, when I'm gone, when I'm not here to stay on top of this thing, he says, I know it's going to unravel. And even among you, he's speaking to the elders, are going to arise people that will detract people away from the kingdom to themselves. Ego has a way of getting in there and drawing. Therefore, be alert. That is to say, be on guard, remembering that night and day for 3 years, I did not stop warning you with tears. You know, my hands are clean. You know, he was with him for 3 years. And, you know, I did the best that I can. Now it's on you. He says in 32, I commit you to God in the word of his grace, which is strong to build you up. He gave him a little fear there. But then he says, look, when I was with you, I coveted no man's silver or gold or clothing. You yourselves know that these hands of mine have provided for my own needs as well as for those with me. He had a work ethic, and the Parushim, the Pharisees, did that, by the way. They were bivocational, which is one of the reasons why they enjoyed more respect from the population than the Sadducees, who were living off of temple proceeds. And I should say, by the way, the average Levitical priest, as distinct from the Sadducean guild, they came in sequence at times and worked in the temple proper with sacrifice and what have you, but they weren't on the payroll. You know, they were able to derive some benefits from the offerings that were made. You know, there was industries that grew up in Jerusalem. You know, animals were offered, they would flay, they would take the skin and offer the animal, and the priests could, you know, sell the skin to tanneries. There were different ancillary businesses that grew up around Jerusalem, but the priests weren't living fat off of it. The Sadducees were. This was the temple complex in Jerusalem. Now the temple or synagogue, I say temple or synagogue, in the Orthodox Jewish world, you would never refer to a local synagogue as a temple. But in the Reformed tradition and the conservative tradition to a certain extent, synagogues can be called temples, but there's really only one temple, that's in Jerusalem. But in any case, in the synagogue, the Pharisees held sway, not the Sadducees, and they were bivocational. And Paul can say, listen, with these hands, to kind of bragging rights. It gave them a kind of freedom to speak their mind too, by the way, because nobody owned them. It's a little easier for me in my pastoral ministry. Certainly as a guest speaker, I go in and give a talk. If people don't like me, they don't invite me back. But it gives me a certain liberty that might not otherwise be there. And even my own congregation, I pastor a little congregation in the Dallas area, but because my principal sources of revenue are from other places, you know, I'm able to more speak my mind. I don't have to worry about anybody. Well, you know, Dr. Seif, I think you were a little harsh here and blah, 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 and all that. I don't have to worry about it. Paul didn't either. He can say, look, I did the best with it, but I don't have leverage over them. He then, in verse 36, after he said that, he knelt down and prayed, and they all began weeping and falling on Paul's neck and kissing him, grieving most of all over the statement he made that they would never see his face again. Then they accompanied him to the ship. A sweet parting, even after all these hard words. I think the hard words really is just in a prophetic tradition. It's more of a warning than anything. You know, don't do this. It's a way of giving voice to that. I think, by the way, that there's way too much coddling in congregations. Rabbis and reverends, as I've already noted, are a little sheepish about speaking this way. I think, and I'll say this, so you can feel free to disagree, that it's good for a congregation to have a guest minister to come in annually and shake them up and just lay it out there. And then the phone rings. Oh, Rabbi, Reverend, they were so harsh and I feel guilty. Yes, I know, Julia, blah, blah, blah. Come on back to the revival tonight. You know, there's something about hearing it. Billy Graham once said, if there was more hell preached in the pulpit, there'd be less hell in the pew. I think there's something to be said for that. People need a warning, and certainly he's giving it. And the warning is for us to be on the ready, to not be bested by the darker sides of our own natures, but to be caring and loving and sharing. You know, it's a warning that's good any day, from generation to generation, and I hope it speaks something to you, that it's not just that these Ephesian elders can become unraveled, but it's that, you know, absent the requisite disciplines, people like me and you, we can become unraveled too. Let's make sure that doesn't happen. Jeffrey Seif here, signing out. Let's do this again next week. God bless.